Today I want to show you Whip Background, which is a tool I made that helps you create fancy animated backgrounds right from the edit page of DaVinci Resolve. Instead of spending all the time on Fusion, building these from scratch, the tool does the hard work for you and lets you create these in just a couple of seconds. It's a part of my editor collection bundle, which I'm going to talk more about at the end, but for now, let's hop into DaVinci Resolve and take a look. Alright, so to add in Whip Background to the timeline, what I want to do is come up to the Effects tab, come down to the Generators, Whip Templates, and then you'll find Whip Background or WhipBG. And so you can just drag this right down to the timeline. It functions as a generator, so we can add that in. We can make this as long as we want. We can shift this back and forth. We can split it, all of that stuff. Another way that I can add that in is by using a keyboard shortcut. So if I do Shift Space, type WhipBG, we can find Whip Background and press Enter, and that adds it in as well and saves you the time of having to go up to the Effects tab and finding it in there. Either way you add that in, the default option is this like dot pattern that is moving around, has some displacement over a gray background, and you can customize all of this and create some really cool and unique designs. Now the first thing I want to do, since I just want to focus on the controls on this main page, is actually come over to the overlay and turn that off by coming into the mode and just setting this to be none. So now we can just focus on the main background controls and not anything that's added on top of that. The first mode that we have is none, and the funny thing about this one is you'd only use it if you have the overlay controls on. It basically lets you create that dot pattern or something else and throw it over a video or something else that you have underneath Whip Background in your timeline. The next one is color, which lets us generate just a solid color or a gradient color. So when I do solid, we just have this one box and we can set this to be any color that we'd like. I really like doing a dark gray. But then we also have the gradient option, which by default is white, and you see it's set to a radial gradient, so we can just click right in the viewer and move these points around to change where the gradient actually starts. And using the gradient type, we could set this to be something like a linear gradient, so we could put this down, or maybe let's put that up in the top left, and then put this one down here, and then clicking on these points, we can click on this back one, and we can customize that to get any color that we'd like. All right, I'm gonna put that back onto solid, and then the next one is noise, which is basically just a fast noise in the background, so we can use that right on the edit page. We can change the scale, we can change the contrast, as well as all of the colors down here, and just add in a little bit of seethe rate, so that way we have some movement in the background. But then the last one we have is the checkerboard pattern. So it creates a checkerboard, we can change the colors of any of those, so if I wanted to make this a little bit brighter, I can do that just like so, and I can change how many grid cells this has with the slider right here. But the one I use most on this is just the color option, because then I can let the overlay section really shine and take advantage of all of those. So let's do that. Let's go over to the overlay tab and set the mode to be grid. So this one, what it does is adds just a bunch of lines in a grid pattern. And the first thing we have is an opacity slider. This is going to be here for all of the different grid modes. Normally how I like to have it set up is set the color to be white, and then if I bring the opacity down, the lines are going to inherit the color of the background. So even if I come to the controls and set this to be a red, since they're transparent, these lines appear to be red as well. So it's a really good way of setting it up, so that way I just have to set the color once, and then the lines automatically inherit that color just because you can see through them. Now, just like the checkerboard, we can change the grid cells, bring this up and down, but this one also has an aspect, so if we wanted to make these, a little bit shorter, and then we can change the thickness of all of those lines. Pretty cool. And the last one we have right here is the grid angle, so we can rotate this around. The shape dropdown is not supposed to be here right now, so I got to take that away. You won't see that in the final version. And then we do have a few other controls right down here, which are also going to be available on some of the other overlay controls, so we'll come back and look at those in just a second. The next mode that I want to look at is the first one that we have, the shapes mode. And so as you can see, it brings over some of those same settings that we used on the last one. So it roughly matches the same size as the grid that we had. It's going to keep the same grid angle, but now we have a few different options. So the first one is padding. If I set the padding to be 1, you're not going to be able to see any of the shapes, so you always want to keep it below that. If we set the padding to be 0, that's going to make it so all of these shapes are touching and there's no padding in between them. So using the grid cells as well as the grid padding, we can change the size and how many of those shapes are on the screen. Now, where this gets really cool is we're not just limited to using a circle. If I come down to the shape, we can bring this down and go to like a rectangle. And for the rectangle, I can change the width and the height, so I can make it a square, I can make it a thin line, I can add in some corner radius. And this also adds a icon angle. So what I can do is just rotate the icons in place and then also shift the entire rotation of the grid. Really flexible, it allows you to do a lot of cool stuff. Resetting those, the next shape option that we have is cross, which is gonna have 2 lines overlaid on top of each other, where we can change the thickness, we can change the corner radius of it, and again, we have those same rotation controls right down here. Now, next up is star, which is also pretty cool, so we can change how many points the star has. I'm going to zoom in so you can see that a little bit better. So we can change how many points, and we can change the depth of them. just by using that control right there. Now, the last shape option is my favorite because it's custom. It lets you do whatever you want. And usually when you do this, you're going to get a big media offline warning right here because we need to tell it what to use as the custom shape. So it has two different options. We have a media in or a loader option. I usually like using the media in because what I can do is just come over to my media pool, grab something like the DaVinci Resolve logo, and then just drop this right in the clip name. And then usually what I have to do is just wiggle my playhead around, and as you can see, it's going to load in that logo all throughout the background. Now in this case, I'm going to bring the opacity up just so we can see it a little bit better, but we again have all those same controls that we can change the padding, we can change the amount of logos in the background, as well as rotate these around or rotate the entire grid. And behind the scenes, this does all the work to make sure that this is really well optimized. And when I press play, you can see it's going to play just as fast as when I was using the circles or anything like that. It runs super smooth. Now, the reason you might want to use the loader node is if you want to make a version of WhipBG background that works between multiple projects, something that you maybe store in power bins or save as your own. Because what the loader does is references the actual file in your system rather than just the file in the media pool. Because right now, if I were to copy WhipBG background and paste this into another project, it'd tell me media offline until I relink that up. But if I used a loader to find this logo on my system, I could copy and paste this between projects, and as long as it's still on my computer, it's going to work no problem. The next thing we have is the mode. So this is set to letterbox and envelope, or you also have the pan and scan option. Now where this does come into play is if you're working with like a 16:9 image and some of those logos or images are overlapping, then you could come in here and set this to be pan and scan, and that'll probably fix the issue. I could also come over here and grab something like my logo, drop this in the clip name. Again, I might have to wiggle it, but as you can see, it's going to load in the logo, and I can use this override color to give this any color that I'd want. So maybe I wanted these to be red. I'm just going to come down to the color, set this to be red, and as you can see, it's gonna put that on all of the logos. All right, before we move on to the next one, let's actually talk about these options right down here. And all of these are going to work the same no matter what shape you select. It's going to work on the grid mode, and most of these work on the lines mode as well. So the first thing we have is movement, and what we can do is just drag the speed up, and I can send this in any direction that I want, and it's just going to infinitely repeat going in that direction at whatever speed that I set right here. Now next up we have rotation, which lets us do some 3D rotation on the, or like changing the perspective a little bit. Now keep in mind that when you turn this on, sometimes it takes a second for it to actually load in the background just because of the node that it's using. But once it does load in, again, it's really optimized, it runs really fast, and I can just grab the X value and I can rotate this around, I can rotate the Y, and I can even rotate the Z. Now these are capped to a value of 30. I believe both of these are at 30, because if you do it too much, it's gonna infinitely mirror the logo and eventually cause DaVinci to crash. So those hard limits are there for a reason. This is about as far as you can go with it performing reliably. And when I press play, you can see even that movement still works with this, and we just have this really cool repeating pattern. Now, whenever I do this 3D effect, what I really like to do is add in some depth of field. So I'm gonna skip the displacement here, come down to depth of field and enable that. Again, this one is one that just takes a second to initialize and load in, but once it does, we have a really nice looking depth of field. We can grab the pivot point and move this around to change which area is in focus. And then we also have a focus area, which basically chooses, how quickly it goes to the maximum blur amount. So normally I like to have this cranked up quite a bit. We can change the blur strength and even the blur angle if we need to change which area is actually in focus. Now going back, we have the displace option. What I'm going to do for this, just so we can really see what's going on, is disable all of the other effects. So no depth of field, no rotation, and no movement. Just so that way we're face on the logos. You can clearly see the difference with this on and off. So when I turn off displacement, it's just going to be a perfectly aligned grid that's not going to have any movement. So a really good way to add movement is to add some displacement. And so when I turn this on, we have an intensity, so it changes how much it's actually going to displace. We can change the scale of it. So as I bring this down to a smaller scale, it's going to be distorting little spots in the image rather than the entire image as a whole. Finally, we have the display speed. So if you want this to be going really fast, you can crank that up, or really slow, which is what I prefer. I just like a really subtle movement going on in the background. And the final thing we have is extra scale. So that comes in if the intensity is too high and you start getting edges where you're not seeing any of the logo. Or maybe if I go this way, So if you ever get to the point that there's like a huge gap in the edge, what you can do is just zoom it in a little bit to try and hide those and make it all feel seamless. All right, and the last option, you'll never guess, all it does is adds a glow to the logos, and down here we can change the glow size as well as the glow intensity. All right, back up at the top, the next mode that we have is lines, and what this does, it uses all of these same options, these modifiers down at the bottom, but it creates lines instead of dots. So we can change the padding again, so a padding of 1 is going to be basically no line, and a padding of 0 is just going to be a solid color. We can change the grid cells to choose how many lines that we actually have. So maybe we'll bring this down like so. And for this one, it's a really good idea to come down here and rotate the grid angle. So that way it's just not parallel with the image. But as you can see, if we come down and make sure that the displace is on and play around with the intensity, it's also going to be displacing these lines. All right, the last option we have is particles, and this is one of my favorites. So as you can see, this is already pulling over that logo that I imported on the last one, because this one uses that same shape system that we'd used on the shapes option. So we can set the shape to be a circle, we can use a rectangle, a cross, a star, or a custom shape like a logo. And when I press play, you can see we just have these particles that are moving around the screen. They'll bounce off the edges so that way they always stay inside of the middle. And it just works really well, and it's so much easier to set up than using the particle system yourself inside of Fusion. Now, one thing to keep in mind with the particles is that the more particles you have and the longer the clip is it's going to take longer for the clip to actually render. And so this is what I mean. You can see even with the 4-minute clip here, it's playing back totally fine, but if I pause it and try and play it again, it's going to take a while before it actually starts playing. We'll see how many seconds it takes here. But once it starts playing, it'll play back at 30 FPS. And that's just because of how the particle system works, that it always has to start at the beginning and calculate where the particles are at, throughout the clip. So normally when you're working with the particle system, what I recommend is keeping your playhead towards the beginning, so that way it updates real quick and is really responsive. We'll go through and make all of our settings, and then we can render this out as a clip, so that way we can reuse that in future projects without having to reset that up and re-render it every single time. But anyways, bringing the countdown to a more reasonable number, we also have stuff like the size. We can change how big the particles are. We can change the variation in the size, so that means some of them are smaller, some of them are bigger. And down here we have stuff for how much the particles rotate. We can change how fast they're actually moving around. So if I crank this up, you can see it's just going to be total chaos as they all go around bouncing off the edges of the screen. But the particles do have their own new option down here, which is the drop shadows. So if I turn off the drop shadow, what you can see is just all of these are going to blend together. But if the drop shadow's on, some of these particles are going to appear over some of the other particles. So it gives this really cool separation and really helps with items like this when they're overlapping, and just adds a little bit of separation. It also has the same depth of field option that we had, as well as the glow option from the other overlay options. Okay, but let's set the mode back to be shapes, and then what we're going to do is bring the opacity down. We're going to set the shape to be a circle, and then let's maybe bring the size down. There we go, so that way we can see some of these dots. The next tab is the masking tab, so it allows us to mask the overlay section of the background. So if I set this to be blob, what it's doing is basically adding a fast noise pattern over it, so it's only going to show the blob in certain areas. So I like having a little bit of see-through rate, maybe changing the scale as well as the contrast, so that way it's only visible in a few sections. Now the other option over here is the rectangle, so it adds a rectangle with an outline, and it's only going to show the overlay inside of this section. And by the way, these work with any of the overlay modes, whether it's lines, grids, particles, or the shapes like we're using right now. And this one lets me change the width, we can change the height, we can change the corner radius, the thickness, and the color all right down here. Now over on the other tab, these are a few of the last things that we can do. So the first one is film grain, that we can add some nice grain to the background just like so. And we have controls for the strength, the roughness, the size. If I turn that off, we also have a stop motion option. And this one's quite cool. So when I turn that on, it's basically only going to update every 12 frames, whatever I set here. So usually when you're doing this, you might want to come down to the displacement, maybe bring the intensity up as well as the speed up. And then when I do that, you'll see that we need just a little bit of extra scale to zoom in, but it's only going to update every 12 frames and give us this cool stop motion effect. Now next we also have a vignette, so we can add some darkening around the edges, or we can brighten it up if we set the color to be a white. But then the last thing we have is chromatic aberration. So when I turn that on, we just have a little bit of an RGB split on all of these dots on the foreground, and it just looks really cool. So that's Whip Background. As you can see, it's a really fast, really powerful background generator that works right on the edit page of DaVinci Resolve, free or paid. It's gonna work. And like I mentioned, this is part of my editor collection bundle. So if you want to get that, as well as like 20 other amazing tools that work on the edit page, just like this one, check that out, link down below. It's what I use to edit all of these videos, doing the zooms, the highlights, putting my camera down in the corner, and I do it all without keyframes thanks to the anim engine inside of that. So yeah, check it out. It's an amazing tool, and you get whip background with it, so you can save a ton of time and make some really cool stuff. If you guys have any questions about this, just let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.